The dry winds blew across the city of Los Angeles, carrying the acrid scent of smoke that lingered in every street and every room. The wildfires, a terrifying annual reality, had grown worse this year. News channels were flooded with grim footage. Firefighters battling relentless flames, families evacuating, and vast stretches of land reduced to ash. Barron Trump, at 15, wasn't like most teenagers. He didn't spend his evenings glued to video games or chatting with friends. Instead, he had a habit of observing people, patterns, and the world around him. As he stood on the balcony of his family's Beverly Hills residence, he watched the distant orange glow on the hills. The fire moved in a way that felt odd. To anyone else, it was just destruction. To Barron, it was a puzzle. Inside, the dining room was filled with the soft clatter of cutlery. Melania called out, "Barron, dinner's ready. Come eat while it's warm." He hesitated, glancing back at the hills one last time before joining his family. The television in the corner played a news broadcast. A reporter, standing in front of an inferno, described the devastation in somber tones. Entire neighborhoods have been evacuated as the flames continue to spread unpredictably, the reporter said. Experts blame high winds and dry conditions, but questions remain about the unusually erratic behavior of these fires. Barron's ears perked up at the word erratic. He looked at his father. "Dad, don't you think there's something strange about this?" Donald Trump, sitting at the head of the table, put down his fork and gave Barron a curious look. "What do you mean, strange?" "The way the fire is moving," Barron replied. "It's not random. Some areas are completely untouched, even though they should have burned." Donald leaned back in his chair, a small smile on his face. "You've got a sharp eye. But wildfires are tricky. Winds change, conditions shift. These things happen." Barron wasn't convinced. "It's more than that. I've been looking at satellite images and maps. It's almost like the fire is avoiding certain places on purpose." Melania placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Maybe you're just imagining it. The firefighters are doing everything they can." Barron didn't argue, but his gut told him he was onto something. After dinner, he went straight to his room, pulled up his laptop, and began analyzing data. Hours passed as he compared heat maps, wind patterns, and live footage. The patterns were undeniable. While middle and lower-income areas were devastated, some wealthier neighborhoods were entirely untouched, even when they were right in the path of the flames. It didn't make sense. Fires didn't discriminate, but this one seemed to. The next day, Barron tried to share his findings with his father again. "Dad, I think this is deliberate. Someone's controlling where the fire spreads." Donald looked at him thoughtfully. "If you really believe that, find proof. Show me something I can't ignore." Barron took his father's words as a challenge. Over the next few days, he dived deeper into his research, even reaching out anonymously to experts online. One night, while scrolling through a wildfire discussion forum, he received a private message. It was brief but chilling. "You're asking the right questions. Meet me at Griffith Park Observatory. Midnight." Barron's heart raced. He stared at the message, debating whether to tell his parents. But he knew they'd never let him go. He made up his mind. Packing a flashlight in his phone, he waited until everyone was asleep before slipping out of the house. The observatory loomed in the distance, its silhouette outlined against the smoke-filled sky. The air was eerily quiet, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Barron waited near the entrance, his nerves on edge. A man stepped out of the shadows. He wore a faded jacket and looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were sharp, scanning the area before settling on Barron. "You're the one digging into the fires," the man said. His voice was rough, like someone who'd spent years shouting over chaos. Barron nodded. "Who are you?" The man hesitated. "Call me Jake. I used to work in private firefighting. The kind of jobs where rich people pay big money to protect their homes." Barron frowned. "That's not illegal, is it?" "No. Jake admitted. But this isn't just about protecting homes. They're steering the fires, using controlled burns to save certain areas while letting others burn. Barron felt a chill run down his spine. Why would they do that? Money. Land values drop after a fire. Developers buy it up cheap, rebuild, and make a fortune. Meanwhile, the rich keep their estates safe, no matter who gets hurt. Jake handed Barron a USB drive. This has everything: emails, maps, contracts. But be careful. The people behind this aren't the kind you want as enemies. Before Barron could respond, Jake disappeared into the darkness. Barron stood there for a moment, clutching the USB drive. The weight of what he'd just learned sank in. This wasn't just a story. It was a conspiracy that could shake the city. Back at home, Barron plugged the USB into his laptop. The files confirmed Jake's claims. Detailed plans outlining how fires were being manipulated, lists of protected properties, and correspondence between wealthy elites and private companies. It was bigger than he'd imagined, but exposing this would be dangerous. Barron wasn't just a teenager anymore. He was a holder of a truth that could change everything. Barron couldn't sleep that night. The files on the USB drive were burned into his mind. Contracts detailing the cost of private firefighting teams, maps showing areas marked as priority protection zones, and emails from high-level officials promising to handle the situation. It was proof of corruption, greed, and manipulation on a scale that left him both angry and determined. The next morning, Barron approached his father cautiously. "Dad, I need to show you something," he said, holding the USB drive in his hand. Donald Trump, seated in his study with a stack of papers, glanced up. "What's this about?" "It's about the fires," Barron said, his voice steady. "I found proof that they're not natural. They're being controlled." Donald raised an eyebrow, leaning forward as Barron plugged the USB into his laptop. He watched in silence as his son pulled up the files, explaining what he had uncovered. By the end, his expression was unreadable. "This is serious," Donald finally said, his tone unusually grave. "If this gets out, it'll blow up the entire system." "That's the point," Barron replied. "People are losing everything while the rich sit back and watch. Someone has to stop it." Donald leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. "You're right, but exposing something like this isn't easy. These people have power, connections. They won't go down without a fight." Barron hesitated. "So, what do we do?" "We need to be smart about this," Donald said. "You can't just throw this online and hope for the best. We need to find someone credible, someone who can back this up and make sure it gets the attention it deserves." Barron nodded. It made sense, but it also felt overwhelming. Who could he trust with something this big? That evening, while his father made calls to discreet contacts, Barron decided to take matters into his own hands. He reached out to a journalist he had followed for years, Sarah Walters, a reporter known for her fearless investigations. Using an anonymous email, he sent her a message. "I have information about the LA wildfires that could change everything. Are you willing to listen?" To his surprise, Sarah replied within an hour, "Meet me at the cafe on 5th and Main. Tomorrow at noon. Come alone." The next day, Barron arrived at the small, nondescript cafe, his nerves on edge. Sarah was easy to spot. A sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with a notepad and recorder on the table in front of her. She looked up as he approached. "You're younger than I expected," she said, motioning for him to sit. "What's your name?" "Call me Alex," Barron replied, sticking to the pseudonym he had used online. "I can't give you my real name." Sarah raised an eyebrow but didn't press him. "All right, Alex. What do you have?" Barron slid a second copy of the USB drive across the table. "Everything you need to know is on here. Contracts, maps, emails. It's all there." Sarah plugged the drive into her laptop, her expression shifting as she scrolled through the files. "This is explosive," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If this is real, it's the kind of story that brings down governments." "It is real," Barron said firmly. "But you have to be careful. The people behind this won't go down without a fight." Sarah nodded. "Don't worry. I've dealt with worse. But you're right to be cautious. I'll need time to verify everything before we publish." As Barron left the cafe, he felt a mix of relief and anxiety. He had taken a step toward exposing the truth, but he knew the hardest part was yet to come. Over the next week, Sarah worked tirelessly to corroborate the information. She reached out to contacts in the fire department, local government, and even private firefighting companies. Each piece of the puzzle fell into place, confirming what Barron had uncovered. But as the story neared completion, strange things began to happen. Sarah's apartment was broken into, though nothing was stolen. Barron noticed a black SUV parked near his house that didn't belong to any neighbors. And one evening, as he walked home from the library, he felt the distinct sensation of being followed. Barron's instincts told him he needed to be careful. He began taking alternate routes home, avoiding using his real name online, and keeping his movements unpredictable. Despite the fear, he refused to back down. He knew the truth was worth the risk. One evening, Sarah called him. "Alex, we're ready to publish," she said. "The story goes live tomorrow morning. I've already alerted a few major outlets. They're going to pick it up once it's out." Barron's heart raced. "Do you think they'll try to stop you?" "They can try," Sarah replied. "But the moment the story's out, it's out. They can't put the genie back in the bottle." The next morning, Barron woke up to a flood of notifications. The story was everywhere. Headlines screaming about the corruption behind the wildfires, the deliberate manipulation of fire paths, and the involvement of powerful elites. Social media exploded with outrage, and protests began forming in front of government buildings. But the backlash was swift. Sarah was targeted with smear campaigns, labeled a liar by certain media outlets. Anonymous threats flooded her inbox. Barron watched from the sidelines, his heart heavy with guilt. He knew this wasn't her fight, it was his. But he also knew revealing his identity would only make things worse. That night, as he sat in his room, his phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "Is this Alex?" a deep voice asked. "Who's asking?" Barron replied, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. "You've made some powerful enemies," the voice said. "But not everyone's against you. Keep going. The truth has more allies than you think." The line went dead before Barron could respond. He stared at the phone, unsure whether to feel relieved or more afraid. In the days that followed, the pressure mounted. Government officials were forced to address the allegations, with some resigning under public scrutiny. Investigations were launched, and private firefighting companies faced lawsuits. The narrative was changing, and Barron knew he had played a part in it. But the fight was far from over. He had exposed the corruption, but the system that allowed it to exist was still in place. Barron realized this wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning. The days following the wildfire expose were chaotic. News channels debated the allegations round the clock. Social media buzzed with hashtags demanding justice, and investigations began uncovering even more layers of corruption. Yet, amidst the chaos, Barron felt a growing sense of dread. The anonymous calls and sightings of unfamiliar cars near his home continued, and he knew the people behind the conspiracy wouldn't give up easily. One evening, Donald called Barron into his study. He looked serious, his usual confident demeanor replaced with something more protective. "Barron," he began, "I know you've been involved in this more than you're letting on. I've made some calls. There are people trying to figure out who leaked the files. You're smart, but you're not invisible." Barron's chest tightened. "I just wanted to do the right thing." Donald's gaze softened. "And you did. But the people you're up against don't play fair. They'll come after anyone they see as a threat. That includes you." Barron felt a mix of fear and resolve. "So what do we do?" Donald leaned forward. "We stay one step ahead. I've spoken to some allies, people who believe in what you've done. They'll help make sure you're safe. But you need to promise me something." "What?" "That you won't take any more risks without telling me. Barron hesitated but nodded. I promise. Despite the precautions, the threats escalated. Sarah Walters, the journalist who had published the exposé, was forced into hiding after an attempted break-in at her office. Online, rumors swirled about the mysterious Alex who had supplied her with the files. Barron knew it was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots. One night, as he lay awake, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It read, "Meet me at the old warehouse on 7th, midnight. Bring everything you've got." Barron stared at the message, his mind racing. Was it a trap, or was it someone who could help? Against his better judgment and his promise to his father, he decided to go. This time, he wouldn't go alone. He called Sarah. The warehouse was dark and empty, the faint sound of dripping water echoing through the vast space. Barron and Sarah stood near the entrance, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. They had agreed to meet the contact together, hoping safety in numbers would deter any foul play. A figure stepped out from the shadows. It was Jake, the former firefighter who had first tipped off Barron about the conspiracy. "You're brave for coming," Jake said, his voice low. "I've been following the fallout from the story. You've done good, but it's not over." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. Jake handed them a folder. "The people behind this, they're already working to cover their tracks. Burning documents, silencing witnesses. If you want real change, you need to hit them where it hurts." Barron opened the folder. Inside were more files, bank statements, contracts, and photos linking the conspiracy to high-ranking officials and corporations. "This is the smoking gun," Jake said. "It'll prove everything. But getting it out there won't be easy." The next few days were a blur of planning and strategizing. Barron, Sarah, and Jake worked together to prepare a follow-up exposé. This time, they aimed to target the people pulling the strings, the ones profiting the most from the manipulated wildfires. They coordinated with whistleblowers, activists, and even law enforcement officials willing to take a stand. The night before the story was set to go live, Barron sat in his room, staring at the city lights. He thought about the families who had lost everything, the firefighters risking their lives, and the countless people who had suffered because of greed. He knew this was his chance to make a difference, to use his privilege for something meaningful. The follow-up exposé hit the news the next morning, and the impact was immediate. The new evidence implicated several high-profile figures, including corporate executives and government officials. Arrests were made, lawsuits were filed, and public outrage reached a boiling point. But with the success came danger. Jake disappeared, leaving only a cryptic message for Sarah. "It's safer this way." Sarah received more threats, forcing her to relocate once again. And Barron, he felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. One evening, as he sat with his parents in the living room, Donald placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did something incredible, Barron. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." "But people are still suffering," Barron said quietly, "and the ones responsible will find a way to come back." Donald nodded. "Maybe, but you've shown the world the truth. You've given people a reason to fight back. That's more than most ever do." In the months that followed, the city began to heal. Stricter regulations were implemented for private firefighting companies, and emergency services received better funding and oversight. The families affected by the fires received aid, and developers faced increased scrutiny. Barron watched from a distance, knowing his role in sparking change. One day, Sarah called him. "The world doesn't know who you are, but I do. And I want you to know you're a hero, Barron. Don't ever forget that." Barron smiled faintly. "I'm just a kid who noticed something." "You're more than that," Sarah said. "You're proof that one person can make a difference." As Barron hung up, he looked out the window at the hills in the distance. The scars of the wildfires were still visible, but so was the regrowth. It was a reminder that even in the face of destruction, there was always a chance for renewal. And for Barron, this was just the beginning of his journey to make the world a better place.